Tax classification of annual income was the main topic of the pie chart. First of all, salary was on the left hand side, whereas property was on the right hand side. Other and business were also highlighted. Furthermore, investment and property was also mentioned. 50% with the salary was the highest, whereas 5% with the other was the lowest. To conclude, investment was the main feature.
The provided image is a pie chart that gives information about tax classification of annual income. There are few categories given such as salary, investments, property, business and other. Firstly, it is evident that the maximum value was covered by salary with 50%. Conversely, the minimum value is covered by other with 5%. Another interesting point of this pie chart is investment with 20%, whereas property covered 15% and business with 10%. To sum up, the pie chart gives information about tax classification of annual income.
The pie chart is about tax classification of annual income. As you can see, salary account for the highest amount, which is 50%. The second place come to investment, which is 20%. On the other hand, property account for smaller amount, which is only 15%. Business only account for 10%. Overall, is about tax classification of annual income.
The image provided is a pie graph that gives information about tax classification of annual income. In the image, there are different percentages of classifications. Classifications such as business, property, investments, and salary. From the image, the biggest percentage is 50%, which signifies salary. The smallest one is business, and the second biggest is investments with 20%. Overall, this image gives important information about the tax classification of annual income.
The pie chart illustrates the information about tax classification of annual income. So it can be noted that the maximum contribution of salary is the 50%, which is the highest placed, and 5% is the contributed by others, which is minimum. And second highlighted feature is that the investment contributed to the 20%. Overall, it can be inferred that salary contributes to the maximum and other contributes to the minimum.
The pie chart gives us information about classification of annual income, where salary has become the highest point, around 50%. Then the following one is for investment, which is around 20%, and then property for 15%. And we have also seen that 10% for business and 5% for other, which is the lowest percent of the pie chart.
The image provided is a chart that gives information about the tax classification of annual income. While we see that the salary contribute about 15% of the annual tax, while the investment include 20% of the income tax and the property include 15% of the annual income tax, while the business also contribute 10% of the tax and other businesses include 5% of the tax. In conclusion, it is very informative graph.
The given pie chart give information about the tax classification of annual income. There are different elements including business, property, investment, salary, and other. The maximum number of salary tax classification of annual income is covered by the salary, which is 50 percentage, and the lowest number of a tax classification of annual income is covered by the other, which is just 5 percentage. So business consists of 10 percentage, property consists of a 15 percentage, and investment are the higher tax classification of annual income, which is 20 percentage. To conclude, the information gives information about the tax clarifications of annual income.
The following picture is a pie chart, and the pie chart gives information about tax classification of annual income. According to the pie chart, the highest percentage is of salary, which is 50.0%, and on the contrary, the lowest percentage is 5.0, which is others. Another interesting point is that investment comes at second position with 20.0 percentage, then comes property with 15.0 percentage, and business with 10.0 percentage. Overall, this is a very interesting pie chart that gives information about tax classification of annual income.
This picture provides is the tax classification of annual information and there is a highest ranking on salary, it's 15%, and the another one is 5% of others and 10% of business. And there is an interesting point that the tax classification of annual income, 15% is only the property and 50% is salary, and the investment is only 20%. The overall picture is the tax classification of annual income, in which salary is the first one and the last one is other species.
The topic was mainly about tax classification of annual income. There is a lot of information in this picture. There are various such aspects as key elements in these pictures. Firstly, we can see that salary and investment. Secondly, we can see that property, business and other number of in these pictures. The highest ratio is salary is 50%. Investment, property, business and other all percentage is low. Overall, this image is very informative and very helpful to the tax classification of annual income.
The given picture is mainly about a pie chart which illustrates tax classification of annual income. The first sector shows 5% followed by 10%. The biggest value tends to be 50%, that is for salary, which is interesting, whereas the least value tends to be 10%, that is for business. Moreover, it is noted that 15% property and 20% investments has the highest trends, which is represented in orange and purple color. To sum up, it's all about tax classification of annual income.
The provided pie chart describes the information on the tax classification of annual income, and we can see there are a lot of information in here provided, and the half of the pie chart is covered by the salary, which is 50%, and followed by the investment, which is 20%, property is 15%, business is 10%, and the other is 5%. So overall we can observe that salary have the highest distribution of the performance on the percentage. So overall the picture looks very informative regarding the tax classification of annual income.
This image is a pie chart that provides information on the tax classification of annual income over various categories. Categories such as salary, investments, property, business, and others. Firstly, it is evident that salary is the highest category with 50%, followed by investments with the largest proportion at 20%. Next, it is property at 15%, followed by business at 10%. The smallest is others category at only just 5%. Overall, this image gives information and illustrates the tax classification of annual income.
The given graph is a pie chart which talks about the tax classification of annual income. So according to this graph, the highest tax is classified in salary, which makes up around 50%. It is being followed by investments, which makes up around 20%, and then property, which totals around 15%. So the minimum tax is being classified in other and businesses, which makes up around 5% and 10% respectively. So to sum up, this diagram talks about the tax classification of the annual income.